其實佢原本係香港人嚟嘅，不過3歲就嚟咗美國，所以我啲廣東話呢就麻麻地。我係未正式學過中文嘅，除咗學咗3個月普通話，仲喺香港學嘅添，抵唔抵死嘅？不過同屋企人仍然都係淨係用廣東話嚟溝通嘅。咁喺三藩市灣區都唔少廣東人嘅，例如台山、香港、湛江等等，所以有時都會同朋友講下嘅。如果仲有朋友嘅話，我最近呢就有留意好多人話廣東話開始消失，呢個就令我受到啟發去寫呢段片。
Because you know, even not in Hong Kong, even people in Guangdong province, there are a lot of people are discussing that. Obviously, Cantonese is dying. You can know the trend.
Now, switching back to a language I can write more than basic phrases and swear words in. Since I'm not an ABC by definition, but I sure am by possibly every other measure. If you're a native speaker, you probably cringed at my intro, but hey, I tried. So although I'm making a video about my heritage, language, and culture, I'll preface this by saying that I didn't really care about it growing up, or even as recently as a year ago. Heck, a while back I started casually learning Italian instead and claim a Japanese corruption of a Roman figure as my fictional 2D waifu. The only thing I can probably claim is that my first words and sentences were in Cantonese, but that's about it. All this to say, I'm no domain expert, nor am I very in tune with the culture or movements, but as a pseudo-ABC trying to reconnect, I have thoughts. It's just a lot of it will be derived from relatively recent research. And then, since it's somewhat a topic of debate, I can't even be sure what's what. Throughout this, I won't really go in depth about language nuances or the developments. There's a lot of material on that out there already in Chinese and in English. I'll just try and paint enough of a picture to give context if someone listening has none. I'll touch on some personal anecdotes, things I learned about the language, evidence of its decline, and some reasons why I think it'll still be around for a while, though in a greatly reduced capacity, which of course is sad for a lot of us. I'm probably also referring to language and culture a bit interchangeably as they're pretty closely related. First off, a bit of background on why I decided to look into this. Put shortly, it mostly revolves around me being conscious of the decline of Cantonese. In longer words, the thought crossed my mind after a recent visit to Hong Kong and Macau. I hadn't been back in 10 years, whereas before then, I almost went yearly for weeks to months. Before I landed there, my parents had visited Guangzhou and made the comment that some younger people they encountered seemed really timid and reluctant to speak Cantonese. You know, in its home region. And when I was there in Hong Kong, I'd noticed a lot of Wee Brother movies on the television channels and even their movies being featured in the cultural center. Now, I love the old Molito stuff. I grew up on it and it makes sense older movies are the ones that are in the cultural center. But I found it interesting that TV was still showing Private Eyes from 1975. Banger theme, by the way. When I got back to the US of A, that stuck in my mind and I got a little curious what those old film greats were doing, especially Stephen Chow, who everyone loves and even Westerners know. I hadn't kept up because CJ7 or Cheung Gong Tat Ho was very mid, while he's directing and writing movies in Mandarin. Which makes sense if you want to reach a broader audience. The whole of China is much bigger than Guangdong or the Greater Bay Area of the Pearl River Delta.
標機有幾隻眼睛？兩隻。我有幾隻眼睛？兩隻。佢冇多過我，我冇少過佢，係咪先？係啊。咁佢可以做到嘅，我一樣可以做到。好有道理喎。
But coupled with this and how great bands like Beyond mostly thrived in the 80s and 90s, and are often older than I am, I couldn't help but notice the cultural shift. This all led down a rabbit hole. I see how even in San Francisco and the Bay Area, Mandarin's becoming more common in Chinatown or on the streets. I see how the number of classes in the Cantonese programs are being reduced. I go onto Reddit and every other day it's a post about the language dying on the sub. Though I admit Reddit, or at least my consumption of it, is pretty doomer. So this culture that I was on the edge of suddenly became much more front and center for me, as it seemed like it was under threat. That, and admittedly certain recent events that made me feel I should be more in touch with my Chinese side. and that right now I have no idea who I am besides being of Chinese heritage. As part of reconnecting with the Cantonese language, of course, I had to start by looking into it and studying it to some degree, even if just informally for 5 minutes a week. Even then, I was able to learn about many quirks that it had compared to the dominant official form of Chinese Mandarin, or Putonghua. There's so much color I either took for granted or flat out didn't know.
I love Cantonese idioms. I think it's a very colorful language.
And this section is really to demonstrate at least part of why I and others may have pride in the culture. Let's start with comparing the two. I'm not going to explain the languages or their histories, that's way too much and I don't even really know it besides basics and geographical distribution maybe. I'll just comment that it's often a debate whether Cantonese is a language with a shared writing system or it's just a dialect.
But basically, Mandarin and Cantonese, they are not mutually intelligible. And this is why I say they are not dialects, they're different languages. The reason the word dialect is used is more of a psychological thing.
And of course, whether a communicative system is considered to be a language or a dialect doesn't only have to do with linguistics, but also with social linguistics, and if we really have to say it, politics.
I'm definitely more on the language side as a beginner learner. Many words are shared, but the difference in tones and the spoken versus written make it rather mutually unintelligible. But also, Cantonese is broad enough that it has its own dialects. Because of standardization, reading the written form with Cantonese pronunciation is a thing it seems, but the reverse would make little sense to Mandarin speakers. To me, this reminds me of something like Italian and Spanish. They might be able to guess what each other are talking about due to some similarities and sharing the alphabet, but essentially there's enough differences that it would just be a lot of guessing and context clues. And this really fits with the dialect versus language argument too, since they are not descendants but siblings, in which Cantonese is the older one. But let's move on to the quirks that I learned which made me appreciate the language's slant on Chinese. First, let's dive into the tones. It's been said that since Cantonese has 6 to 9 tones, depending if entering tones or yapsang are counted. It's also known as 九聲六調。
係一定係嘅，好易記嘅一樣就係番茄醬牛腩麵不吃辣。
This is contrasted with Mandarin's 4 tones, and it makes it seem much more complex to learn, right? Especially when many can't hear the differences in the tones. Well, besides sounding closer to ancient Chinese, one great advantage is having more distinguishing factors to each word. Since there's more tones, words become more distinct. In Mandarin, the lesser variety of tones apparently has caused the need to have word pairings to make it more specific.
Cantonese has a rich set of up to 9 tones, so it would be unnecessary to use 2 syllables as much to avoid confusion like Mandarin.
Saying mo by definition is shorter than mo yao or meyo. Something else I looked into is the insistence on being paired with traditional characters versus the simplified characters. Now, this isn't unique to Cantonese. Taiwan speaks Mandarin and uses traditional characters, but I still found it interesting to look into. Again, simplified, the new standard has less strokes, so it seems like it should be easier to learn. But apparently, instead of having a semi-arbitrary character for its sound, a complex character can do that and convey some meaning as well. This results in less overlap between words.
形聲字體結構中往往有聲音同意義，簡體字同樣破壞咗形聲字嘅結構，以致冇辦法讀音同埋解義。例如寬、官係形聲字，讀音都係由冠變化出嚟，而簡體字佢哋變咗做咁樣咁樣，文字結構同讀音嘅關聯被破壞，變咗又要死記個字嘅讀音。另外，原來唔相似嘅漢字簡化之後，卻變成形狀相似嘅字，反而造成變應困難。例如風、鳳變成咁樣咁樣，東、落變成咁樣咁樣。 闖廣變成咁樣咁樣等等。
Again, having less to work with just means more clashes, more homophones, like how and how to how, or mean to mean. Imagine wanting to eat faces.
My God.
Tracing back to how Cantonese is closer to classical Chinese, one thing I never noticed was how much it spread. This has made it so even if Canto disappeared today, it's got traces in languages like Korean and Japanese. One that I didn't expect was Vietnamese. And for the ratio of Mandarin to Cantonese speakers, there's a great share of loanwords from Cantonese in English, as Cantonese people went abroad early and often. There's also how a lot of Westerners' early contact with China was through Guangzhou, both through aforementioned emigration and less friendly means throughout the area.
You tin the form. I want my $20 back, you stupid Chinese pig!
The last thing is something I knew quite well given my long history of watching Molly Tao, the slang. Obviously, there will be slang and regional slang in Mandarin if we go beyond the state standardized language, but I'll go out on a limb and say there's also a cultural aspect, as at least historically, places like Hong Kong have been much more allowing of swearing.
我好中意廣東話嘅粗口，因為比其他語言即係例如英文啊或者德文啊 expressive 好多，冇人講粗口好似香港人講粗口。
佢喺此房間切勿行開，將會有一大水柱由此窿射向裡面之際啊！請將此珠脷塞向此窿，明解冇？明解。講字聽下。妖，陣間有條老年咁大嘅水柱喺呢個窿度射到你個冚家產一面都係嘅時候咧，你就將呢條撲街珠脷塞落你老尾呢個窿度啊！哦，早講啊你！
I suspect this is why, despite Mandarin being more common, slang and swears are everywhere in Cantonese, including in films.
We'll focus on Cantonese only, as examples of Cantonese expletives are more common in films. Thank you, Hong Kong.
After all, Hong Kongers hate everything and everyone, apparently.
Koreans will hate out of competition and bitterness. Japanese hated other Asians for existing. But Hong Kongers are not malicious. They just hate for fun.
哎呀，你们是不是说话很凶啊？怎么那么没有礼貌？但我想说，那不是没礼貌，那是我们的语气文化，而是熟肉直接，里面带着尊重和情感的，是不是很直接？但是也很地道，很真實啊！喂，衰仔，幾時翻嚟飲靚湯啊？
As a last point here, I was quite amused when I tried to translate a phrase for the intro and GPT admitted there's no direct translation.
哎呀，粵語死硬啦！
With that overly bloated context out of the way, what about the original topic, the death of Cantonese? As noted before, the entire Cantosphere seems to revolve around the death. There's a lot of obvious and clear reasons for this, with the standardization of Mandarin and subsequent government push as the most obvious. Let's start by looking into the effects of that. Broadly speaking, the enforcement of a common language has led to a lot of public communications being switched from Cantonese to Mandarin, especially in regions like Gongxai and, of course, Guangdong.
咁相比我之前嘅期望嚟講咧，係好分㗎啦，都唔係好肯開口去講啊，唔知點解。
More damning is the effect of it on education, as a language being passed on to the next generation is the key to its survival.
我個口音嗰個問題，因為咧，我細個嗰陣時咧，我因為屋企人做嘢關係咧，我係會喺佛山呢邊返學嘅，返學不斷地講普通話，所以我就覺得其實係真係粵語文化係要去保護嘅咯，就。
This is especially pronounced in Gongxai, which, from my research, I couldn't find as much information on movements there to pass on Cantonese. But even besides that, we're still seeing other signs.
人哋李顯龍個總理，新加坡個總理，以為嚟到廣州梗係講廣州話啦，用廣州話同啲小朋友打招呼，冇一個小朋友識聽。
我是廣州人，不會說廣州話。我是廣州人，不會說廣州話。
I would be remiss to not mention the Guangdong National Language Regulations of 2012 here as well, which from what I could tell was designed to eliminate Cantonese broadcasting and official usage. Naturally, these types of actions lead to concern in the Cantonese places outside of Guangdong that it would soon come for them, and that this repression simply makes it not a viable or useful language. And unfortunately, of course, we've seen this happen elsewhere, like with Irish, where English became the language of instruction and Irish people emigrated elsewhere, much like what happened with Guangdong. Even more striking, though, is the stigma associated with what some call a dialect. Not too long ago, before the language regulations, there were reports of Canto shaming where even if it wasn't officially banned, use of Cantonese was discouraged or even punished by individual schools' rules. In addition to that, there's locals getting told off for the continued use of Cantonese and social media shaming as well for creating Cantonese content on Chinese platforms.
喂，唔講普通話就躝出中國，真係好撚離譜咯！我會講粵語有錯咩？你睇下 Beyond 嘅音樂、李小龍嘅動作片，佢哋唔係一樣衝出國際咩？
And maybe it's behind why it's not even spoken at home.
爆頭，我真係唔明點解有啲家長會覺得小朋友喺學校講完普通話，翻到屋企再講普通話係冇問題，甚至係可以遷就佢去講普通話，因為佢哋覺得大個咗自然識講粵語㗎啦。我想問下咧，如果你細個阿媽唔教你揸筷子，你大個你識唔識？其實我哋從來都冇抗拒過去學習、去講，甚至係宣傳普通話。但係粵語係我哋由細講到大嘅母語。
It's probably worth mentioning here, though, that a part of this may be Cantonese being associated with revolution, as Hong Kong puts it as a core part of their identity and a distinguishing factor from China. Anyway, with this being a subject for debate, I do get mixed signals as an outsider on whether or not there's no more Cantonese in Guangzhou.
面前啊，最炒料5蚊2就係晒咯。哦，你講咩春啊？面諗咩咯？面諗啊，你快食屎啦！
I won't go into it too much now with examples and such, but as said earlier, since Mandarin's cultural influence is growing in China, educational opportunities and produced media in Cantonese is declining. This becomes clear as we look at China's economic boom, which eclipses the importance of Cantonese region like Hong Kong. In fact, as Shenzhen or Shenzhen was established as a special economic region, their GDP also eclipsed Hong Kong's. This rapid growth was fueled by migration. The existing population was definitely not reproducing that quickly. Anyways, this led to Mandarin being more prolific in the area. This could also be seen in Guangdong, which is considered a first-tier city.
So I went downtown to investigate, and it was true. Mandarin did reign supreme, but mainly because downtown is actually full of migrants from other provinces.
Then you have how people are very practical. If the locals are learned in common languages, the migrants don't need to learn any of the local language. Like how American tourists will only American English when they travel. Ameriglish? Americanese? Moving on to the next section. So it's been a lot of gloom and doom for Cantonese thus far. I've heard the argument nowadays that even though it's in decline, it's not exactly being suppressed.
推廣普通話嘅目的咧，就係為咗令到新中國人人都識講一種共通嘅語言，而唔係好似國民黨政府咁樣要求所謂嘅國語統一。
And in fact, there are efforts to keep it alive and well. So I want to look into this and see what it's about. Call it copium if you will. I think I need some given everything else in life and the world. A video I watched about how one can help save Cantonese had mentioned that pride, appeal, and usefulness are 3 factors that would keep a language alive. I quite like that summary. As I looked through the efforts to preserve language, I could see various ties back to these 3 ideas. Going back to language regulations as a first example, Guangdong people were not happy about the proposal to cut off language. It triggered one of the biggest protests in modern Chinese history, and forced the government to back down and clarify they weren't trying to kill Cantonese. One could argue they're trying to use more covert methods now, but the point is that Cantonese had pride in their culture.
廣東話係我哋廣東人日常所有語言，佢唔單止象徵住我哋廣東人嘅身份，佢都承載咗我哋呢個社會各種嘅文化。
我覺得啦，我哋講廣東話嘅話，就代表我哋係廣東人。
Without being outright outlawed, there's been signs of interest. From what I could find, formal education is obviously more limited than Mandarin, but available in the form of programs and electives. And on the other hand, informal learning, self-study, and tutors appear available and searchable even to an outsider like me. There's also a declaration of protection of language resources made by the country in 2019, but honestly I'm not sure what it does and what steps were taken as a result of it. Perhaps more telling, though, are the grassroots movements. It appears that locals spin up resources to help migrants integrate into Guangdong's culture, which of course only matters if there is a desire to do so. This comes back to the usefulness and appeal points mentioned earlier. Usefulness, probably not so much when everyone knows the common language. Appeal, you'll need local culture to participate in. The continued flow of culture helps keep relevancy as people become interested to learn through exposure.
你講啱啲啊，我仲係啊，跟滾話。
我唔信，你啲口音幾好啊！
A great example is Japanese. By the numbers, it's not much of a bigger language than Cantonese, but many people want to learn it, probably because they put out so much anime and video. Back to cultural interest. There's been some things here and there that signal that people do appear to take an interest in Cantonese. For a time, it was trendy to try and pick it up in Shenzhen. There have been shows like 粵講粵掂, which I'd probably roughly translate to the more you speak, the better you get. Switching out one of the characters for that or Cantonese or Yue language. Something that surprised me was the inclusion of Cantonese in MiHoYo's Zenless Zone Zero, a game developed by a mainland Chinese company.
唔使，放我哋喺岸邊就得啦，會有人嚟接我哋嘅，唔勞你費心。
師傅，你們在說什麼？從剛才開始我就沒怎麼聽懂。
唔使，送我哋喺岸邊就得啦。
These kinds of continued productions are really necessary to prevent the language feeling like it's just a gibberish relic that family forces you to speak.
感覺嘰里咕嚕的。
One thing that was particularly interesting to me was Singapore cracked down, probably even harder, on enforcing Mandarin, and once universal usage was achieved, they softened the ban. Young people then apparently start to show interest in other Chinese varieties, resulting in more integration and provided courses. Feeling connected or curious is also a vital driver to learning if it's not taught as a mandatory subject in schools, and this seems like it's mostly been the case with language throughout the ages anyway.
嗰個表達咧係差少少嘅，因為我哋唔係正式，我 OK 喎，唔係正式，我就唔係咯，其實唔係正式㗎嘛，都係由細到大，因為我哋趁朋友而去學中文，睇電視啊，睇電視啊咁樣。
Shift in mentality is important here, combined with the aforementioned culture that lures in interest. Like how apparently second-gen migrants to Shenzhen experience Hong Kong culture and pick up Cantonese along the way.
而家對粵語嘅文化咧，其實都幾尊重嘅，尤其是佢哋唱歌咁，全部都係廣東話嘅。我覺得你話如果佢係想打擊粵語文化，咁唔會要求佢哋唱啊，甚至乎啲海闊天空嗰啲咁樣大合唱類型嘅歌，就連普通話嘅歌手都係會唱廣東話。
對不起，我不能講普通話。有幾多人係講廣東話㗎？沒辦法，對不起，學一下廣東話。
But mentality is especially true for the Chinese that are very practical and not concerned about continuing Cantonese for continuing sake. But there's also an emphasis on learning later, hence the electives in higher grades.
先將普通話嘅水平去到一定嘅時候，再喺粵語方面俾佢多啲了解粵語嘅特色咯。
And this needs to hinge on the youth's understanding their roots and coming back to them.
你又覺得呢個現象點樣啊？正唔正常呢個現象？唔正常嚇？唔正常。唔正常。所以你哋其實都比較想講廣州話。
Fortunately, attitudes may be changing to recognize this diversity in Chinese heritage, which sparks interest in it.
但係而家我哋會知道其實文化冇級數，冇好啲定唔好啲，只有唔同嘅啫文化。咁但係亦都會學會尊重咯。
When there's interest but fewer formal opportunities, accessibility is a great help. For learners, a more standardized romanization system would work wonders. Mandarin Pinyin is great in my opinion and easy to follow. Cantonese has some work to do, though I think we're generally coalescing around Yuping. Either way, having a system is one thing, but leveraging it is another. More tools for learners beyond static web pages or textbooks. Mediums up to date with where technology is now and where people spend their time. These are probably things worth investing in, as even now many Cantonese speakers never had formal education in it and they still speak it fine. Fortunately, with modern tooling for the motivated, I think getting started is probably easier than ever. For ABCs, CBCs, or the like, Bing added Cantonese, and more recently Google added it, of questionable quality.
Something more advanced. 幾條麻甩佬喺度吹水, a few jerks are chatting. But when you do it backwards, jerks translate to 仆街 in Cantonese. Strange thing is, if you type in 仆街 alone, it translates to servant. If you have a domestic helper, never call them 仆街.
The best tool I found, though, surprise surprise, has been the advent of large language models, more commonly referred to as the AIs. While I don't know the availability of such tools in China or the performance of their alternatives there, for everyone else, learning is becoming more accessible, But either way, they probably should be paired with a native speaker or tutor.
你係咪屎忽痕啊？
你是不是屁股癢嘛？
呢個終於啱咗啦。不過呢，你係咪屎忽痕呢？雖然翻譯過嚟係真係屁股癢，但係佢係有另外一種意思㗎。
亂咁噏你收皮啦。
So, having rambled for however long that was, I have to say that I understand the push for lingua franca in Mandarin. To govern such a large and diverse country, something had to be implemented to both allow mobility within and communication throughout. There's nothing wrong with that, but I also think regional languages can exist with a strong grasp of national language for formal and communication matters on the side. Otherwise, we should have everyone in the world speak one language, some manufactured mix of English, Spanish, and Mandarin, or whatnot. But I don't think anyone actually wants that. But as far as standardized Chinese goes, with such intertwined roots, they can and should coexist and can evolve.
粵語點解仲可以咁流行、咁有生命力同傳播力咧？好重要就係佢可以好好咁同中文嘅書面語兼容，咁同時咧又可以吸收大量嚟自英語、日語、葡語等外國語言嘅詞彙。
And I will say, as a descendant of Cantonese, 我學了一點普通話，還在努力學習。
郵冊達3000多萬人次，其中2/3左右的內地旅客。
It's hard for me to tell the current state in Guangzhou, and even on-the-ground videos can be very cherry-picked examples depending on what slant someone wants to push.
喺廣州市荔灣區發現一名小學生竟然識得講粵語，我哋將會出動本台特派記者希嬸去現場睇下。希嬸啊，同我哋講下現場環境係點樣嘅？我只會一點點，不是很會。可以向我們展示一下嗎？大家好，我叫做陳大文，今年10歲。哇！各位觀眾，今日將為歷史性嘅一刻，我哋終於喺廣州揾到一位識得講粵語嘅小朋友啦！哇！好感動啊！
However, when a language and its culture is rendered secondary in its own homeland, decline will be inevitable. For Cantonese, which is estimated between 80 to 120 million speakers, depending who you ask, more than the population of countries like Germany or Italy, it may take generations to become a very niche thing.
廣東語言式微咧，我相信唔係咁容易，起碼有個港澳喺度，仲有個聯合國喺度，依家仲係承認粵語係官方語言嚟嘅。
Perhaps it just transitions from native language to heritage, like it is for me, to be honest. It's not a unique problem at all either. One standout example is Catalan in Spain, and their fight to exist still seems to be at the top level. Then, as I've been learning Italian, their story of Standard Italian sounded similar to Standard Chinese, a push for a unity derived from one variant, in their case Tuscan, overriding many localized variants and dialects like Sicilian, Corsican, or Barese.
Do you understand anything? It's almost impossible. It's another language.
It is another language, yeah.
Another example is French minorities. Often cited are the differences in Quebec and Louisiana. It thrives in Quebec and is nearly dead in Louisiana, as the US government has really pushed English first, a familiar story. In Switzerland, I have no idea what's going on there. But as we went over earlier, there is a story of cultural interest and revival, even when a culture is pushed to its brink. In Louisiana, it appears French is gaining traction again. Perhaps more interestingly, just across from Hong Kong, patois is being preserved now in opera and studies in Macau, despite having maybe only 50 speakers left. As primary language share falls, numbers don't necessarily have to go down overall, in terms of raw numbers versus percentage. So maybe dying is sensationalism. Never heard of that in media before, right? Maybe just fading to a corner like an introvert friend you've wronged. And there may be reasons to sensationalize. People may want to sound the alarm to accelerate preservation. Or they might want to downplay it to prevent people avoiding Cantonese thinking it's obsolete and useless. In the end, I feel survival falls down to people caring about their culture, and while government policy can cause a decline until it's outright banned, or even if, a true death probably only happens when nobody cares anymore across the globe. We can't suddenly make Cantonese the lingua franca, or make Hong Kong so economically important that its golden age is harkened back to. Cantonia doesn't seem realistic. If Cantonese speakers want their language to go on another generation, do what my parents did, use it at home. All even while I grew up in America and Cantonese rarely helped my daily life, if at all.
由細講粵語大嘅我哋係有責任將自己嘅語言傳承落去。
嗱，好簡單，喺學校唔俾講廣東話，咁翻到屋企唔俾講普通話咯。咁肯定喺屋企細個先教個細路學粵語先啦。咁啲普通話靠老師教噶啦，肯定。
要靠家長嗰方面去咯，係咯。
The next generation just may grow up and become interested in their roots as they age. Might not, but they might.
但后来我发现，其实这是上帝给我们南方的孩子的一个礼物，因为我们就多了一种跟普通话完全不一样的一种语言。直到我慢慢长大之后，开始深入的了解自己的方言之后，发现方言里面的很多词语它都非常美。
Keep speaking it.
So don't just switch to Mandarin so quickly, or don't shy away from speaking. People cannot be shy about trying to speak Chinese. You have to continue to try to speak Chinese, even if you're not that good at it.
咁今日咧，我又做一個挑戰。
挑戰。
咁今日咧，我又做一個挑戰，咁就係咧，一天只講廣東話，係咁咩？
係一日。
一日。
再俾我聽到你兩個講普通話，我打你。
As a collective, create movies and music and video games in Cantonese. And when people do become interested, cut it out with the just redirecting them to be practical and do something else. And stop making it hard for people without fluency to try and practice. Make it easier to learn with various resources than just picking up pieces here and there. Hold more competitions and events that promote fluency. Remove those barriers. Might not be the easiest, but it's possible to have a common utility language and a native one. Maybe that's easier in some places than others, but exposure increases the likeliness of interest.
請問一下，你而家對粵語咁熟練嘅原因係乜嘢呢？
就多聽、多講、多學、多聽嘛，就周圍的人講得多，你就聽得多，就努力的去辨別，去聽他們在講什麼東西。你看港劇。
And a defeatist mindset will simply make the death of Cantonese a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think. You know what? I don't actually know shit about Chinese or China. I'm gonna go back to playing guitar.